"Is this seat taken, or are you saving it for someone who actually belongs here?" The voice was dry, not cruel. Just tired in the way that people get tired when they have stopped expecting kindness from strangers. Colette Marsh heard it from across the lounge. She was sitting at the far end of the Air Canada Maple Leaf Lounge. Terminal 3 Gate 42. With a glass of sparkling water she had not touched and a phone she kept checking out of habit. The flight to Halifax was delayed by 2 hours. She had already rearranged 3 meetings, eaten half a protein bar, and read the same paragraph of her quarterly report 4 times without absorbing a word. She looked up. Near the entrance beside the coat rack where nobody ever left coats stood an older man. He was perhaps 70. Maybe older. His jacket was clean but the collar was worn soft, the kind of wear that came from years of careful use rather than carelessness. He carried a small duffel bag the color of old moss. His shoes were resoled, his hands were large and steady. The kind of hands that had spent a lifetime doing precise work. The lounge attendant, a young woman named Brianna, whose lanyard said she had been working there 6 months, was looking at the man with the polite, weaponized blankness that people in service roles use when they want you to disappear without technically asking you to leave. "This lounge requires a qualifying business class ticket or a priority pass membership," Brianna said. "I can check your boarding pass again if you'd like." The man held out his boarding pass. Brianna looked at it for the 3rd time, or what felt like the 3rd time based on the exhaustion in the man's face. "I have a ticket," he said. "I've had a ticket for 40 years. Brianna's smile did not move. "I understand, sir, it's just that the system is showing the system is wrong." He said it without anger, just fact. "It happens sometimes. I'd like to sit down." Brianna glanced around, looking for a manager or a reason or both. Colette set down her phone. She had spent the last 11 months rebuilding the board of Marsh Capital after her father's retirement, learning when to stay quiet and when to move first. She had fired 2 executives, restructured a subsidiary, and survived a hostile takeover attempt by people who had known her since she was 12 years old and still did not take her seriously. She had learned to read rooms. She had learned when a thing was worth addressing and when it was better to look away. She was tired of looking away. "He can sit with me," Colette said across the lounge, loud enough to land. The man turned. Several other travelers looked up from their laptops. "I'm sorry," Brianna said. "He can sit with me," Colette repeated. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her and set it on the floor. "There's a seat right here and I'd appreciate some company." The man looked at her. He did not look grateful. He looked like someone trying to decide if this was another form of pity dressed up as generosity. Colette held his gaze. She was not being kind out of guilt. She was being kind because the alternative was to sit here for 2 hours, watching someone be quietly erased from a room he had every right to enter. After a moment he walked toward her. His name was Douglas Hartwell. He told her so after he sat down and she handed him a glass of water without asking whether he wanted it, because he clearly needed it and they were both adults who could skip the performance of offering. "Colette Marsh," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted barely. The way a word looks when it almost means something before you decide it doesn't. "I knew a Marsh once," he said. "Long time ago." "Common enough name," she said. "Not that Marsh." He settled back in the chair with the care of a man whose joints remembered weather. "What takes you to Halifax? Work you?" He was quiet for a moment. "My daughter, or the woman I raised as my daughter. It's complicated." He said it the way people say it when they mean it's simple but painful. Colette did not press. She had learned that lesson from her father. Silence was not emptiness. It was just space that the right person would fill when they were ready. Douglas Hartwell filled it about 10 minutes later. He had been a pediatric surgeon for 37 years, he told her. Not famous. Not the kind that published papers and gave talks in Vienna. The kind that operated on children in the middle of the night in Moncton and Fredericton, and once memorably on a fishing boat near the Northumberland Strait, because the child could not wait for the helicopter. He had worked in hospitals across 3 provinces. He had done good work. He had been good at it. He retired at 68. His hands were still steady, his mind was still precise. But his son-in-law had decided otherwise. He said that last part quietly. His daughter was married to a man named Warren Alcott, who sat on the hospital board, who had friends in administration, who had spent the last 2 years constructing a story, piece by piece, the way you build something ugly, slowly, so nobody notices until it's already standing. Anonymous complaints. A suggestion of tremors that didn't exist. A review that had been influenced before it began. Douglas had tried to fight it through the right channels. He had documentation, colleagues, 37 years of flawless operating records. None of it had mattered. "And your daughter?" Colette asked. Douglas looked at his water glass. "She believes him." The words came out flat, not defeated, just worn smooth by repetition like a stone that had been carried too long. Colette looked at his hands. She thought about her own father, who had handed her the company at 64, because he said she was ready and he trusted her. And she had spent the first 6 months, certain she would destroy everything he built. She thought about the board members who had smiled at her face and worked against her behind closed doors. She thought about trust as a thing that can be weaponized. "How long has it been?" she asked. 14 months since they suspended my privileges. 8 months since my daughter stopped taking my calls." He paused. 6 months since I moved out of the house in Halifax because the rent on a surgeon's pension goes faster than you'd think when you're paying for lawyers." Colette was quiet. Then she said, "Where are you staying now?" He said the name of a motel on the edge of Dartmouth. She knew it. It was the kind of place that rented by the week and kept the heat set to the temperature of barely trying. She thought about saying something careful. She was very good at saying careful things. Instead she asked, "What's the name of the hospital where you practiced?" He looked at her for a long moment. "North Shore General. But I should tell you something before you go looking, Miss Marsh. I've had 3 lawyers, 2 union representatives and a journalist from the Chronicle Herald. Warren Alcott is very good at making things go away." "He hasn't met me," Colette said. Douglas studied her face. She could see him deciding. He was a man who had spent decades making quick decisions in high-pressure rooms, and whatever he saw in her face, he let himself trust it. "My file number with the College of Physicians is DR4409, he said. "If you're going to look, start there, and then look at who requested the original performance review and when." 6 weeks before it was filed, Warren Alcott attended a gala fundraiser for the hospital foundation. He sat at the same table as the chief of medical staff. Colette picked up her phone and wrote it down. The flight was called 20 minutes later. They boarded separately, his ticket placing him 4 rows behind her. But before they reached the gate, Douglas Hartwell touched her arm, gently the way doctors learn to touch, without startling anyone. "I don't know why you care," he said. "You don't know me." Colette thought about the lounge attendant's careful blankness. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into where people had already decided she didn't belong, before she had opened her mouth, before they knew what she knew or what she could do. "I know enough," she said. She spent the flight on her laptop, which was not unusual. What was unusual was what she was reading, not the quarterly report, not the restructuring plan for the Atlantic subsidiary. She was reading Douglas Hartwell's professional record, which was publicly available through the College of Physicians if you knew where to look. Which she did, because she sat on the board of a hospital foundation in Toronto, and had learned the system in the process of reforming it. 37 years. 412 documented complex surgeries in children under the age of 6. A rate of post-operative complications that sat at the bottom of the provincial chart, meaning nearly none. A letter of commendation from the chief of pediatrics in 2019. Another in 2021. A profile in New Brunswick Medicine Quarterly that called him, without exaggeration, one of the best pediatric surgeons working in the Atlantic provinces. And then, in 2022, a performance review initiated by one Dr. Raymond Fuchs, Chief of Medical Staff, North Shore General, citing concerns about motor coordination and clinical judgment. The review had been conducted over 4 weeks. The report was sealed. Colette leaned back in her seat and looked at the clouds outside the oval window. She was a woman who had learned to read the architecture of things, the structure underneath what was visible. She had learned it from her father, who had learned it from his, and it was the only inheritance she valued more than the company itself. What she could see here was not incompetence. What she could see was construction. Carefully laid foundations for a story that someone needed to be true. She thought about what Douglas had said. "My daughter believes him." She had never had children. She had chosen that deliberately and without much regret. But she had a niece, 7 years old, who called her Coco and sent her drawings of horses in the mail, real paper mail, because her sister believed in it. And she could not imagine the weight of being 70 years old, and knowing that the one person you had raised, fed, worried over, loved without ambiguity, had chosen someone else's version of you. By the time the plane landed, she had made 4 calls, left 2 messages, and sent 1 email to a contact at the Nova Scotia Medical Society who owed her a professional courtesy. She did not tell Douglas any of this when they walked through the terminal together and stopped near the baggage claim. "Do you need a ride?" she asked. He looked at her. "I have a bus. I have a car service. The driver can take you." He almost said no. She could see it forming, the quiet pride of a man who had spent his whole life being capable. She recognized it because she had felt it herself in the months after her father retired, when colleagues kept offering to help her in ways that felt like preparing to catch her when she fell. "I'm not going to disappear?" she said. "I'm not doing this once and then forgetting your name, but you don't have to take the car if you'd rather not." He took the car. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her hotel room on the 22nd floor with a view of the harbor, the lights of Dartmouth scattered across the dark water, and she worked. She had learned to work at night in the years after her father stepped back. When the days were too full of being watched, and nights were the only time she could think without performing. By 2 in the morning she had the shape of it. Warren Alcott had served on the North Shore General Foundation Board for 4 years. Dr. Raymond Fuchs had been appointed Chief of Medical Staff 18 months before the performance review. The appointment had been recommended by the Foundation Board. The foundation had received a significant donation the year prior from Alcott Property Holdings, which was Warren Alcott's development company, which also held the land adjacent to the hospital's planned expansion site. She set down her coffee cup. It was not subtle, actually. It was only hidden because nobody had wanted to look, or nobody had known to look, or nobody had been willing to follow the money through 5 layers of board minutes and donation records and planning approvals. Colette had built a career on following money. She called her lawyer at 7 in the morning. She called the journalist from the Chronicle Herald, whose name Douglas had mentioned, and left a message. She called Douglas himself at 8, and asked him to meet her for breakfast. He arrived looking as though he had not slept either. But not from worry. From something older. The habitual sleeplessness of a man who had spent decades being called in the night. She set a printed summary on the table between them. She did not explain it before he read it. She had learned that people understood things better when they found their own way through the evidence. He read it slowly. She watched his face. Something happened in it that she had not fully expected. It was not satisfaction, not immediately, it was grief. She saw it move through him, briefly before the other thing arrived. Because the summary made clear what she already knew and he had suspected. His suspension had not been about medicine. His suspension had been about land. Warren Alcott had needed Douglas out of the house. Douglas's presence, his pension, his professional standing, had been obstacles to a financial arrangement that required the Hartwell name and the Hartwell assets to be accessible in ways they would not be if Douglas remained a respected surgeon with standing in the community, and a wife who trusted his judgment over her husband's. Douglas set the papers down. He pressed his hands flat on the table. The hands that had operated on children in the dark, that had been steady for 37 years, were shaking very slightly now. "My daughter doesn't know," he said. It was not a question. "There's no evidence she does," Colette said. He was quiet. "She's not a bad person," he said finally. "I want you to understand that. She married someone she thought was good, and he was good at the beginning." He looked out the window at the breakfast traffic on Barrington Street. "I watched him change. I watched him start deciding that the things he wanted were more important than the things that were true. And I watched my daughter." He stopped. He cleared his throat. She wanted to believe him. It's easier to believe the person who's in the room with you every day than the person who keeps saying things are wrong. Colette thought about that for a long time. She thought about her own board members, the ones who had smiled at her face and worked against her. She thought about the moments when she had doubted herself, when she had wondered if they were right and she was the problem. She thought about how much easier it would have been to simply believe them. To accept the simpler story. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked. He smiled for the first time that morning. A small private smile, the kind that belonged to a memory. "Fiona," he said. Colette nodded. Then she said, "She's going to have to decide what to do with this. You can't make that decision for her, but she should have the truth first." He looked at her. "And if she still chooses him?" The question sat between them. "Then she chooses him," Colette said. "But it won't be because she was lied to." The next 2 days moved quickly in the way that days move when something is finally happening after too long a stillness. The journalist from the Chronicle Herald called back and was very interested. Colette's contact at the Nova Scotia Medical Society confirmed that the sealed performance review had procedural irregularities. Specifically, that 2 of the 3 reviewing physicians had disclosed conflicts of interest after the fact rather than before, which should have voided the process entirely. Colette's lawyer filed a formal complaint with the College of Physicians on Douglas's behalf on a Thursday afternoon. On Friday morning, Warren Alcott's company announced a temporary delay in the North Shore expansion project, citing revised planning timelines, which was the kind of language that meant someone had started asking questions about the land deal, and someone else had started being careful. Colette was at a meeting across town when her phone showed a number she didn't recognize. Halifax area code. She let it ring. The voicemail was 14 seconds long. She listened to it in the parking garage afterward, standing between her rental car and a concrete pillar. It was a woman's voice, youngish, careful in the way people sound when they are trying to say something they have been afraid to say. "My name is Fiona Hartwell. I think you know my father. I'd like to talk to you, if that's all right. I've been reading some things. I need to understand what's actually happened." Colette stood in the parking garage and breathed. She called back immediately. They met at a coffee shop on Queen Street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and good tea and the general atmosphere of a room where difficult things got said and somehow survived. Fiona Hartwell was 34, or she looked it, with her father's precise hands and her mother's eyes, or so Colette guessed based on the one photograph Douglas had shown her on his phone. She was holding her mug with both hands when Colette arrived, not for warmth, for something to hold. Colette sat down and did not start by being reassuring. She had learned that false reassurance in the first 30 seconds of a hard conversation was a way of telling someone that their feelings were an inconvenience you were trying to manage. She ordered tea. She waited. "I found the donation records," Fiona said. I didn't know where else to start, so I started with what I could access, and I know what it looks like. I just need someone to tell me if it is what it looks like. It is, Colette said. Fiona looked at her table. Her jaw tightened. She did not cry, which Colette respected. She was doing something harder than crying. She was taking inventory. How long have you known my father? She asked. I met him 4 days ago in an airport lounge. Fiona looked up. He needed a place to sit, Colette said, and someone had decided he didn't qualify. I disagreed. Something moved across Fiona's face, something complicated that started as confusion and shifted toward a kind of painful recognition. He never told me, she said quietly. About the motel, I didn't know he was. She stopped. He wouldn't tell me because he knew I'd feel guilty. And he knew that if I felt guilty I might do something impulsive instead of thinking clearly. She swallowed. That is completely something he would do. He talks about you the way people talk about someone they've never stopped believing in, Colette said. Fiona pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller and more honest. I believed my husband. For a long time I believed him, and I know it sounds human, Colette said. You believed the person who was closest to you. That's what people do. He was very convincing, she said. Warren is very good at making the caring part feel real. Even when everything else is wrong, the caring part always felt real. She looked at the table. I kept thinking if he really loved me, he wouldn't do this. And then I'd tell myself I was wrong, or I was being unfair, or I was letting my father's resentment bias me. She stopped. My father didn't have resentment. I know that now. He just had the truth, and Warren had a better story. Colette said nothing. Fiona looked at her. Her eyes were wet, but her face was steady. I want to fix this. I don't know how. I don't know what I can do that hasn't already been done, but I want to fix it. You can start by talking to your father, Colette said. Fiona nodded. One breath. Then quietly, is he okay? He's tired, Colette said. But he's the steadiest person I've met in a long time. Fiona closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them they were clearer. He always was. What happened next happened in ways that were both faster and slower than anyone had anticipated. Warren Alcott retained legal counsel within 48 hours of the Chronicle Herald making inquiries, which told its own story. The Medical Society's review board announced it was reopening the performance assessment file, citing procedural concerns, which was a cautious and bureaucratic way of saying that the original process had been corrupted. 3 members of the North Shore General Foundation board quietly resigned. One of them sent Douglas Hartwell an unsigned letter that said, in 4 lines, that they should not have let it happen and they were sorry. It was not enough, it was something. Fiona moved out of the house in Armdale on a Tuesday. She did not make a scene. She packed what was hers and she left, and Colette, who had no reason to be there except that Fiona had asked her to be, waited in a car outside and drove her to a friend's place in the North End. On the drive over, Fiona sat in the back with a canvas bag on her lap and looked out the window at the streets of a city she had lived in her whole life. I keep thinking I should feel worse, she said. Colette glanced in the rearview mirror. Like I should be devastated. I loved him. I'm not performing when I say that. Fiona looked at a streetlight they were passing. But I think I've been grieving for 2 years already. Slowly, without knowing that's what it was. Grieving the person he was when we first met and the life I thought we were building. She was quiet for a moment. I don't have that much grief left for the ending. Colette thought about that. She thought about the long months after her father retired, the grief she hadn't named at the time, for the version of herself that had existed when he was there to tell her she was doing fine, the ending of one arrangement and the beginning of a lonelier one. That's not a failure, Colette said. Doing your grieving in advance, it means you were paying attention. Fiona looked at her in the mirror, then she gave a small tired smile. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone more. She thought about it. Professional, distant. You're a Bay Street name. I looked you up. Bay Street names are just people who learn to look at the architecture of things, Colette said. Some of us use it to take, some of us use it to see. Fiona held that for a moment. Then she said quietly, thank you, for seeing my dad. Colette thought about the lounge attendant. She thought about Douglas standing at the coat rack with his moss-colored bag and his 37 years, waiting for someone to decide whether he qualified. He qualified, she said. Douglas Hartwell's medical privileges were formally reinstated on a Thursday morning in February, 7 months after Colette had handed him a glass of water in an airport lounge. She was in a board meeting in Toronto when her assistant put a note on the table in front of her. She read it once, then folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She waited until the meeting finished and the room had emptied. Then she stood alone in the boardroom, looking out at the city below, and allowed herself 1 full minute of something that wasn't strategy or structure, or looking at the architecture of things. The note from his daughter was brief. It said, he walked into the hospital this morning. He looked like himself again. I thought you should know. Warren Alcott resigned from the foundation board 2 weeks later. The land deal was investigated by the Provincial Planning Authority. Legal proceedings were ongoing, which meant they were slow and imperfect and real, which was the closest thing to justice that the world tended to offer. Colette received a card in the mail on a Friday in March. Paper mail, handwritten, which was rarer than it should be. The handwriting was large and careful, the handwriting of someone who had spent decades writing notes in a hurry and had finally slowed down. It said, 37 years ago I stopped believing that rooms I walked into would simply let me stay. I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as someone who belonged. You reminded me I won't forget it, and neither will she. Colette read it twice. Then she set it on her desk beside the drawing of a horse her niece had sent last week, in real paper mail, because her sister believed in it. She thought about Douglas Hartwell walking through a hospital door, on a Thursday morning in February, and she thought about the small, precise steadiness of his hands, and she thought about how many rooms had been built specifically, so that certain people would feel they did not qualify to enter them. She had walked into enough of those rooms herself. She thought she would keep walking in,